on a very local level, maybe we need to start finding some common ground with people that we actually disagree with. And we need to start thinking about how do we actually have those conversations, as difficult as they are right now, as difficult as they may be, when there is, just vast differences and vast disagreements about the way that the world should work. But if we can't find that common ground, then who are we as a people and who are we as a country? And so, yeah, it could be that, it's a dual track that we have to kind of explore.
Welcome to Season 2 of the VIRIVERSE Live podcast. Before we get into the conversation today, we invite you to join us for a mindful minute or two to aid the transition from whatever you were just doing into today's experience with our anonymous changemaker. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Chance here, also your designer, and I'd like to welcome you back to the VIRIVERSE once again, the place where changemakers come to unlock a balanced soul and scale positive impact. Last week, we were reminded of a few pretty cool things in our conversation with a changemaker just like you. Number one is that changemakers have really great vision, but the doing and building part, turning that into reality, can be really difficult. And we also talked a little bit about how you also at the same time can't make a plant grow faster. You just have to continue to nurture it and it will grow. So taking steps, setting up the right environment can be really healthy. And we're also left with a few questions. The biggest one centered around how do you feel good about doing work and how do you stay accountable to doing your work? So thanks again to our changemaker from last week. And a few of these things may just aid our anonymous changemaker for today's conversation. So here we go. I would like to once again introduce you to your moon mentor and our dear friend, MCK, also known as the Present Squirrel. Welcome back to his most special home as the Viridescent Mothership leaves us all on the moon of Qusada.
Thanks, Chance, and hey everyone, I'm MCK, aka the Present Squirrel. So Bounce is a tool created to help entrepreneurial change makers like you to make better decisions faster without second guessing yourself, even if you're a chronic overthinker, which we all can fall victim to. And so before we jump in, for those of you who have yet to experience Bounce, the anonymous changemaker and I are about to have a 20-minute conversation where they will be open and honest about a situation that's top of mind for them. I'll simply be a great listener and ask them a series of good questions. In our audience today, we have a couple of other changemakers who will be observing the conversation and offering their best question at the end. So if you're an observer, the link to the Observer Insights spreadsheet is in your email. And if you can't find it, message the researcher. After today's event, all the insights you input will be shared with our anonymous changemaker to aid in their decision-making process. So without any further ado, let's get started. So anonymous changemaker, are you ready to go?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So 1, 2, 3, what's on your mind?
Oh, so much is on my mind, MCK. This week feels like it's been incredibly momentous in the news. I've personally been thinking a lot about mobility over the last period of time, especially the last 6 weeks that I was just in Italy. But I have to say that top of mind this week is really about what's going on in the world and in the country in particular. I mean, we've had some momentous decisions brought down by the Supreme Court. We've had the January 6th hearings. It just feels like a very fraught time. And it feels like we're in some respects regressing as a society. And I don't know what to do about it. It feels like, that we need some collective action. We need some collective organizing. And I'm thinking long and hard about what my role is in it and how I can stay mobile enough to really take action and do something about what I feel is like taking us into a dangerous situation as a country. So, yeah, lots of stuff going on in my head right now.
Yeah, I hear it. So, I guess this is such a big question. How do we make it a little bit smaller?
Yeah, I think that that's really a good place to start. And I've been thinking about that. It's like, we talk a lot about organizing, and we right now we're seeing people out in the streets protesting, and we're seeing lots of people having conversations about what to do about some of the decisions that have come down and what's going on in the country. And to some degree, I think we have to start to think about, and what I've been thinking about is, how do I make this very personal and very local? Like, who can I reach out to most immediately to try and organize? Who do I know that is a lawyer? Who do I know that's a doctor? Who do I know that's an event organizer? Who do I know that is somebody that's really good at creating communities and bringing communities together? And can I activate that small group of people to take some action? Because I think it's great for people to be out in the street protesting, but ultimately I'm not sure that facilitates the kind of change that we need. And in some respects, I think that if you can bring it down to a personal and a very local level, you might be able to start to facilitate some kind of change, because from there you can start to think about, okay, how do I get those people to vote? How do I get them to activate their own networks and their own spheres of influence to get people to go out and vote? Because voting might be the only way that we can really make some of the changes that we would like to make. So, I think, what I've been trying to think about is like, who do I know and how do I activate that group of people?
So this is pretty interesting, because the question that was starting to come up for me was, what does facilitate the kind of change that we need? And it sounds like you answered that. You said getting people to vote.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a firm believer in voting, and I think that we have to do everything that we can, and hopefully, some of what has been coming down this week in terms of the news is pissing people off enough to where they will go out and vote. And I'm thinking especially in terms of some of the demographics that have traditionally not been voters, young people, millennials. Some of the demographics, in minority communities that have had a hard time and a struggle getting out to vote. How do we support, groups that are really trying to facilitate people getting out to vote? And how do we start to message in the right way? Because I feel like a lot, in a lot of cases, our political parties and whomever you support have not done a good job of messaging in a way that really gets people inspired and wanting to participate in our civic society. If you look at traditional, voting patterns, like in midterms that we have coming up, typically voter turnout is fairly low. It's in the 40 to 50%. And, we need way more action. We need way more participation in our civic society if we're going to address the division that is happening right now within the country.
So that sounds interesting. There's the voting part and there's the division part.
Yeah.
Which part is more personal to you?
to me, the voting part is more personal, because I think that you can't solve the division part, without the voting part. I feel like we have reached a point where it's incredibly difficult to even have conversations with people that you disagree with. And so, for me, I think that we have to change, the pattern of voting and change the pattern of civic participation, and start to, look at, getting people to actually vote their values and actually vote what they think is important to them. And that can be a broad range of things, obviously, but for me personally, I care about climate change, for example, and I think we're about to see the Supreme Court make a decision that's going to make it incredibly hard for the EPA, for example, to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, which ultimately could lead to business in general and federal agencies in general, having a difficult time regulating things that are harmful to us as human beings and to the planet. And, so again, without the capability of putting in place a political, system that facilitates some progress in terms of climate change, in terms of business regulation, in terms of the things that I hold dear, I think we're going to have a hard time, getting out of the place that just feels so divisive right now. So for me, voting is like, a number one. And I think that, it's kind of like, I wish that I could clone myself sometimes and move to, various different places in the country and work on voting in areas of the country that are way different than where I live.
So, you mentioned that you can't really have convos with people you disagree, like in general, people have a hard time having conversations with people they disagree with. I guess I keep coming back to, why is voting number one for that, rather than trying to address what makes it difficult to have conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It feels like, and maybe it's that, there's a dual track here, and that you have to kind of work on both. But for example, if we had, a Congress right now that was less concerned about staying in power and more concerned about actually addressing issues for the American people, and that might require a supermajority of one political party over another. And the only way to achieve that is by voting in, people that are part of that supermajority. You could actually get things done. Mm-hmm. But yes, to your point, there is a dual track where, on a very local level, maybe we need to start finding some common ground with people that we actually disagree with. And we need to start thinking about, how do we actually have those conversations, as difficult as they are right now, as difficult as they may be, when there is, just vast differences and vast disagreements about the way that the world should work. But if we can't find that common ground, then who are we as a people, and who are we as a country? And so, yeah, it could be that, it's a dual track that we have to kind of explore.
Yeah. So we're coming up on 10 minutes now. Uh-huh. How is this conversation going, and how are you feeling?
I think the conversation is going great. Again, I think there's so much that we could talk about. We could probably talk about all of this stuff all day long. I'm feeling okay, but I'm feeling frustrated, because I feel like, I tend to be an introvert in general. And so it's always a bit difficult for me to, to think about this stuff, but then to actually take that action, to go out and find that group of people and start to have some of these conversations, start to activate that kind of local community. So, there's a bit of a bit of frustration for me, but I do feel positive in a way, in that having this conversation and starting to think about what are the things that all of us can do, is motivating in some respects.
Cool. And has there been a question or a moment so far that's been particularly helpful or useful?
Well, I think the question about why is voting more important than the conversation is a good one. And I think I've been so focused on the voting part of it that it's useful to kind of step back away from that and understand that we need to think about things in sort of dual tracks sometimes, that we can't get so focused on one thing that we lose track of like everything else that's going on around us.
So I guess one question that I have that's connected to that is, you brought up climate change.
Yeah.
And how that's something that, is important to you. I think you might have said even like near and dear to you.
Right.
Where does that kind of fit into this? Because like here we're talking about sort of like voting in general, and then we're talking about, the divisiveness, between people. And then we're talking about people that, is hard to control, who are representing us, that are making certain decisions.
Yeah.
Sometimes the ones that we vote in, sometimes the ones that we don't. And I guess like how does climate change fit into all this for you? And when you think about sort of your ability to influence, where does this rank in these in these areas that we're talking about?
It ranks pretty high. I mean, I have been focused on kind of sustainability and climate change for a number of years. I mean, even going back to the 1970s when Earth Day first started, I was always, very interested in environmental stuff. But over the years, that has, become even more prevalent. And as I, have a daughter, I have granddaughters, I have a great granddaughter, I think a lot about their future. And I think a lot about, not even the people that are here now, but the people that are still to come. What is that world going to look like for them when you've got, rising seas, and you've got, extreme weather things going on, not to mention, the societal part of that, where we've seen, low-income communities be impacted worse than others for generations now in terms of pollution and just general danger from the places that they live. So it is something that I am very, very focused on, and have been working on for a number of years. And it feels frustrating that we haven't made more progress. Frustrating in some respects, but there are positive things going on as well. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there are positive things going on and positive conversations going on. But yeah, climate change is important to me. And while I was in Italy, I was doing some writing, and I wrote one poem, and I took this actually from a conversation that I heard from another environmental person. But it's kind of like this idea of like, you can't care for the earth and not care for people, and you cannot care for people and not care for the earth. Were kind of two lines that I wrote in a poem that I wrote just recently. And so, kind of that feeling of like, we have to care for people, but we have to care for the earth at the same time, are kind of like, kind of what I've been thinking about a lot lately.
So how does this connect to the voting and the divisive conversations? And, if we try to like think of these things together,
yeah,
what's the best way to think about that? Or how, 1970 was, a couple years ago. So you've been working on this for a couple years.
Yeah.
Or at least, had that interest and grown into the work that you've been doing. So yeah, I guess where does that stand, or where does that relate to, the voting and the divisive conversations?
it feels like all of one piece to me. I mean, there's so much interconnectedness and interdependency amongst all of these things. If we're going to organize as a society and live together as tribes of people, or one big tribe, if that were the ideal, it all feels of a piece to me that we have to look at the interconnectedness and the interdependency of all these things, and have to start to think about, how do we get out of, the tribalism, if you will, where people just separate themselves into their own little enclaves and their own little ideologies, and start to think about, we're all in this together. How do we collectively work on these things, and how do we start to, even if we don't agree about certain things within, let's say, climate change, even if we don't agree that, climate change is one, happening, or two, caused by humans, or three, part of an extinction, thing going on in the world. How do we at least find enough common ground that we can think about these things and work on these things, even with people that we disagree with? I think there's a lot there to kind of unpack, and I think there's a lot to think about there. But this is kind of what goes on in my head sometimes around all of these questions.
Yeah. So, you've brought up the dual track, and it's like interesting how that's manifested in a number of different ways through our conversation. Like, we all have a fixed amount of time in the day.
Yeah.
Is a dual track possible? And is it realistic to think that you can actually make progress on more than one thing?
That probably comes down to, how you operate in the world to some degree. I think for me, sure, I think I can work on more than one thing at a time. I hope that I can. The time thing is always an issue, obviously, for everybody. But, I feel like I have time right now. And again, it just comes back to, getting out of my sort of introverted state, if you will, and actually putting some of this into action, as opposed to just thinking about it and having conversation about it. I have a friend who used to write a blog that was titled Less Conversation, More Action. And that's kind of where I feel like I'm at right now, is like I need to get out of the conversation bit and get into the action bit a bit more. So yeah, I feel like it is possible to work on more than one thing at a time. It just takes a bit more focus, perhaps, than just being hyper focused on one thing.
Yeah. So we are getting close to 20 minutes and coming to the close of our conversation. Based on what we've talked about, what would you like to do, or what would you like to try next? Speaking of action.
Yeah. Well, I'll come back to what I said kind of at the beginning. I think what I would like to do next is to even just work in my neighborhood and work within my circle of friends, and start to, see if I can get a group of friends together and have, obviously have some conversation, but actually start to think about how do we collectively take action to, have the right conversations, even with people that we disagree with, but also to, think about the voting piece of it. Can we get people registered to vote? Can we get people out to vote? Can we start to think about how we message to those people? So there's a lot of things that, I think that I can do next in terms of activating even just a small group of people.
Super. Well, thank you for being so open and honest, and for sharing your situation with me.
Well, thank you for asking really great questions and opening up the conversation to what could obviously be a much broader conversation.
Of course. All right, so I know that those 20 minutes went by pretty quickly, and our brains process in different ways and at different speeds. So for everyone here joining us live, and even for those of you listening to this conversation after the fact, what I want to do is I want us to take the next 2 minutes to write down any additional observations, insights, or questions that come to mind. Or, if you're a little bit like me and we're ferociously taking notes, go back over your notes and circle the things that really stood out to you. Or you can do both. Afterwards, we'll have our observers share their biggest takeaway and one question that they'd like to ask today's anonymous changemaker. So, ready, set, 2 minutes starts now. Got about 15 seconds to go. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're done. So moving on to the sharing is caring portion of our conversation. Hey, designer, I know you've been listening in along with the rest of the Observer crew. And after taking a couple minutes to consolidate some of that thinking, what kind of insights, what kind of questions can we now offer our anonymous changemaker at this point in the conversation?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, once again, it's just really interesting to sit back and just listen to someone that thinks, feels, experiences life in a similar way that we do as people that want to make a better world, right? And I think that I still sit around this kind of thread that is woven from last week too, about the vision part being really solid for change makers. That's something that comes natural, is relatively easy. It's kind of how we're built, but that the making of the change is hard. But in this conversation, I think what I started thinking about is how hard it is in this system that is built and maintained by those in power. And so I think my biggest takeaway is thinking about like where we're at, certainly in the United States, but I think a lot of nations and places around the world are dealing with similar challenges, is that we're getting to this place where the majority of a community, a locale, a country are wanting real action on big problems. And certainly here in the United States, it's our government leaders are not taking true action for fear of losing their power that they hold. And, for America, when we get to a place of democracy becoming too greedy or too fear-based, we lose our freedom and we become less progressive. And that's concerning. So I think that's the thing that really stood out to me. The question that I have is kind of a three-part question, is where do we think that COVID fits into this struggle of making impact and taking, action-oriented steps being hard? is there something about us as change makers being better at this prior to the disruption and slowdown of like quarantine, and that maybe ramping up might be harder than we're realizing? So I think I'd leave that with our anonymous change maker today is, how do we break free of that? And is that true, right? Something to really consider. So I'd love to throw it over to one of our other observers in the audience to share their insight and favorite question for the road. So let's go over to the researcher first, and then we'll queue up the restoration to join us as well.
Thank you, the designer. Wow, this was a great conversation. Thank you to the anonymous changemaker for articulating exactly how I think so many of us are feeling. My biggest takeaway, and I think this is also just kind of something that I've been personally grappling with, so it just really hit home, is kind of this idea of how do we respond when everything seems to be falling apart on a micro level and then on a macro level. I think that's really powerful. And so I think the kind of takeaway question I would throw out to the anonymous changemaker is, given your kind of initial question of how you approach this loss of mobility within yourself, do you think that the approach to your own personal mobility and how you respond to the brokenness of the world are connected? And this idea of like, how does one bend rather than break? And, extend that out, how do we as a species bend rather than break in the face of all the changes and all of the, the meta crisis that we're feeling? So yeah, that's what I would leave the anonymous changemaker with.
Ooh, that may keep them busy. That's a really good question. Wow. Okay, so let's welcome up the restoration here in the VIRIVERSE. Love to have you come up and share your insight and a question for the road.
The anonymous changemaker brought up a lot of good points, and I think MCK did a really good job of navigating that conversation and bringing it in places where, because we started out a little bit broad, or actually a little bit narrow, then broad, and then back to focus again. One of the takeaways that I could get from the discussion, I could sense that there was a lot of fatigue within the anonymous changemaker. I can sense that this was a problem that he's maybe been wrestling with for a little bit. I think an interesting part about the mobility issue that he brought up was the fact that there's just so many groups that you have to bring together in order to move some of the problems that we're dealing with forward. And the mobility aspect for me is intriguing because as someone bit on the younger end, my worldview, I'm looking at the world that we're living in right now, and it seems to be the mobility issue is like I guess a solution that everyone is kind of coming to is we're going to be more of a nomadic lifestyle, so to speak, moving forward. I think given how climate has impacted our daily living in ways that we really haven't, I don't think as a whole have begun to really truly appreciate. I think that society as a whole, and also world governments, or not just this one, but world governments as a whole, are going to be making some adjustments. But some of, I guess one question I would have for the anonymous changemaker, is someone still new to this space, in your opinion, are there any groups, people, or organizations that are currently solving the problems that you're describing, or any that are actually, or that are working with any models that you think have the potential to scale into something a little bit more effective?
Fantastic. Okay. Well, a couple of really great things that I think can aid in everybody's process as we think about these questions. So, of course, we're all eagerly waiting to hear from the present squirrel. MCK, what was your kind of big insight? And did you have a last question to leave with our guest today?
Yeah, thanks, Chance. And thanks to you all these great insights and questions from you observing today. The restoration, really great to also get to meet you in this space. So I think my biggest takeaway from today kind of has to do with this like dual track thing that was going on. I was finding that like super interesting, and then thinking about these various important, I guess, tracks, that are there, and as they continue to seem to build up and pile up, and it just made me thinking about like there's the philosophies around like doing that one singular thing that you can get great at and be number one or number two at in the world, and then be able to make change in that way, versus if we're working on things in parallel tracks, how does that perhaps, bring us to the desired change, desired result that we hope to see in the world. So that was kind of like one of my, big takeaways. And I guess the question that I wanted to ask that there wasn't enough space for today, because, as Restoration pointed out, it's kind of this huge topic. What's the opening question to people in your neighborhood or like your community, whether you perceive that they agree with you or not? So thinking about like, how do these conversations get kickstarted, and how do they, get started in a way that can be most helpful for them and for you and for the, for us, as this larger cause. So as our conversation today comes to a close, for all of you listening, if your interest was piqued by today's balance conversation and you have a desire to get greater clarity and make better decisions faster in your life, I've put together a trifecta of prompts to help you out. So you can join the VIRIVERSE email experience at the link that the researcher will be popping into the chat now, or that you can see in your show notes, and you'll receive prompt 1 of 3 tomorrow after you sign up. So back over to you to close out, Chance.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, MCK. And so as we kind of wrap, I want to go back to the anonymous changemaker one more time, saying thank you for being a part of today's conversation and being so open and honest with your situation. But love to offer you an opportunity to kind of share a final insight. So the question is, what's been most valuable for you in participating in today's conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Chance. Well, it's been fascinating hearing everybody's kind of takeaway, and I love some of the questions that came back to me. I guess what I would want to say is that, as much as I may be fatigued and frustrated and cynical at this point, I don't think that we can get lost in that. I think we have to get out of that frustration, out of that cynicism, out of that fatigue, because we're at a place right now where we really do need to take action. And, so I would encourage, much like I've been thinking about, I would just encourage everybody listening to kind of take the same approach and start to think about, is there a circle of friends, a circle of community that you can start to address and have some of these conversations and start to take the actions that you think align with your own values? So that's kind of what I'd like to leave it with.
What a wonderful place to end. So as a kind of offering a pathway to taking a more active role, certainly from the Moon of QSATA in the world, in the VIRIVERSE, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, we invite you to join us as an observer in these conversations. So for the live audience, you can email the researcher. You see link in the chat, and that will be in the show notes for anyone listening after the fact as well. So, lastly, of course, just thank you to everybody for joining us in these conversations and helping support a change maker just like you. We will see you all next week. For now, this is your Vera Vigilantes signing out with a little nature experience. As always, later, friends, and be well.